real small naturally between the parties. We're not talking, I mean, real business to decide to really de-escalate, find real compromise.
This morning, just hours after thousands of residents were ordered to evacuate. Officials say debris is shooting up almost 10,000 meters into the air. There are no reports of any damage or injuries at this time. The last time this volcano erupted was back in 1979.
So the municipality of Durham just got hacked, and the city of Toronto is working on changing no exit signs are misleading to pedestrians. Well, not really, because they're for cars, right?
Small business owners to develop strategies and creative digital solutions.
But with May, we're moving into a very dangerous period where the politicians and the diplomats should really go to work to defuse this situation before it gets out of hand.
We haven't mentioned it. The very important change in Washington since 6 or 8 months ago, when, as Alexei said, there was an apparent stabilization along the line of control, has been, of course, the election of President Biden. And his anti-Russian tendencies and pro-Ukrainian tendencies have provided an irresistible magnet, I think, for Ukrainian nationalists to test how far they can go. So when I mentioned earlier the aggression by the Ukrainian army, the war crimes really towards people living behind the line of contact, they were deliberate, pushing the boundaries to see how far they could push Washington. Now let's look at Washington. We have this senior official, Victoria Nuland, who was in fact the architect of the Maidan coup in February 2014, the famous cookie lady who was giving cookies to the nationalists and interfering quite blatantly in Ukrainian internal politics. She acted with control now of the State Department, and there's certainly a war party around her and her sympathizers in Washington. On the other hand, the US military has a very prudent appreciation of the dangers of getting too far involved in Ukrainian fighting. They saw what happened to the Georgian army in Georgia in 2008. They don't want to see a repeat of that debacle. And so Biden is to me very much the question mark in the middle of all this. I don't think Biden has really focused on the Ukrainian crisis at the moment. I think his hands are full of domestic crises, the pandemic, the economy, and so on, and he hasn't really focused on Ukraine. But when he does, I would hope that the very good analysis that Carvel was offering a few moments ago will be hitting Biden's desk, and he will be concluding that the United States has to wind Kiev back, that there is nothing for the West in this conflict escalating. Only bad news can come from it. And you see, Putin is helping in that regard because he has also been, I think, pressed by Russian forces who've been impatient that he's been too soft on the west of Ukraine. There are people within Russia who are saying Putin has got to stand up harder for the Russian world. I think he's realized that, and all those escalation moves that were recited by Palmer are, I think, entirely understandable and entirely appropriate. He's not preparing for war. He's sending an unmistakable signal to Biden that Biden, if he allows Kiev to entice the United States into military alliance over this, he will be making a huge mistake because it will be the end of Ukraine. So that would be what I would add to what has been said so far.
Thanks, gentlemen. You're listening now to our live broadcast of World Today. We've been talking about Russia-Ukraine tensions over Donbass region. Let's have a short break. We'll be back in a minute.
I just had a little more bloodsucker like in a goddamn way. The bastard must have been on my leg for like an hour. On my clothes or whatever, like the last hour.
Hello everyone, this is Soon Ahmed Khan, journalist from Pakistan, currently based in Tsinghua University, World Today is an excellent initiative to discuss current affairs by
Oh,
including
you had a bit of a
experts from
stomachache, don't
across
worry.
the
The
globe.
little
I've
bastards
always
bite me,
enjoyed our
and then their
thought-provoking
stomachs
discussions
explode.
and wish
So
the team
shit.
even more success and impact in the future. I am Dan Wang, China analyst from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Today is a very fun program. It is a place you hear interesting people discuss global events, social trends, and what is happening in China and in the rest of the world. So, friends around the world, hope you can join us.
What if everybody decides fuck it? We've already done so many nuclear damage. We just fuck it. We'll just set off a few here. It doesn't really matter. Isn't that what North Korea was essentially?
Hello, this is
going
Michael
at?
John.
Isn't that what the U.S.
Greetings
policy
from Los
and
Angeles
Russian
of the
policy
golden
pretty much
state of
always did?
California.
That fucking hurt like
Thank you
ass.
today for making me part of your team.
It took one
I
bite
truly
and
enjoyed the debates we had
damn,
and
it's
look
bad.
forward to many more in the years to come.
Hello, I'm Joya Seed, First Secretary of the Embassy of Chile to China. It's been an honor taking part on your show and telling you about the relationship between Chile and China. Wishing you all the best.
Welcome back to World Today, the panel discussion with Mika Anna in Beijing. We've been talking about the love and hate story between Russia and Ukraine and the root causes of their conflicts. Let's continue our discussion with our guest, Tony Kevin, former Australian ambassador to Poland and author of the book Return to Moscow, Pavel Falkenhauer, Russian military analyst, and Dr. Alexei Muraviev, Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University in Australia. Alexei, we've been talking about the U.S. factor in the current Ukraine and Russian tensions. Many observers believe the conflict in the eastern part of the Ukraine poses a threat to the NATO and to U.S. President Joe Biden. Will they get involved in a war against Russia on behalf of Ukraine?
Well, I would agree with what Tony was saying before the break, that currently Joe Biden has too much domestic problems on his hands, and starting his presidency with getting the United States involved in a war where for the majority of the Americans, Ukraine means very little, would not make strategic sense. I mean, for Biden, it's a question of obviously trying not to see his supporters in Ukraine losing militarily or suffering catastrophic defeat in terms of significant losses of territory or perhaps the end of sovereignty for Ukraine. So in this sense, he's trying to obviously contain Russia's moves also by demonstrating that he is not backing down to Putin's pressures. But on the other hand, I cannot possibly see that the United States will commit itself or NATO allies militarily. They realize that forces they would be able to bring into the theater would not be sufficient to deter the Russians from moving in. The Russians, as Pavel already said, the Russian army is fully mobilized and is currently in the middle of undertaking exercise activity, maneuvering forces, overtly displaying its intent. Whilst NATO will take time for it to get its act together and move in, and given the fact that the majority of Europeans are not really willing to see their service personnel returning back in backs, I don't think such a move by committing something militarily to a possible conflict in Ukraine would be welcomed in Europe. So the best that the United States or Europeans can do is further tighten sanctions against Russia, but I don't think they would be able to do anything tangible apart from perhaps moving aircraft, apart from deploying ships into the Black Sea, running some flights over Ukrainian national airspace, perhaps trying to prevent Russian Air Force penetrating to find Ukrainian territory. But that's as far as it would go, because there is also a realization that one thing you fight the proxy war, Another thing, you confront a nuclear superpower directly, because who is going to guarantee that the conflict can be contained at the local level and it's not going to escalate to full-scale conventional and unconventional military confrontation, particularly in the light of recently adopted Russia's nuclear strategic deterrent concept, which effectively provided a fairly open detail about when Russia will be willing to escalate from a conventional conflict to unconventional, and what sort of considerations it will have in order to make a strategic decision by releasing tactical or strategic nuclear munitions.
Although, as Alexei mentioned, the proxy war or direct involvement in the military confrontation, what's your take on U.S. population in this?
But if there is anything happening there, that's going to be proxy. Most likely, yes, it will, but there are complications. Let's say the West has already decided to move additional warships to the Black Sea, and Russia in the Black Sea is gathering a very, very large armada. Ships are steaming in from different directions, from the Baltic Sea. 3 big landing ships have steamed through the British Channel. From the Caspian Sea, 10 warships, landing craft, mostly are also going in. So there'll be maybe a big Russian naval move in the, at least there's the
all these lines are going to change
on the table, and that means the Russian fleet and the American fleet can mingle, or NATO fleets can mingle between each other in the Black Sea, and there can be, well, different incidents in the air and on the sea. That could begin to escalate. Of course, right now, the good news is that nothing's, Russian ships are being moved from the Baltic. That means nothing's most likely been happening in the Baltic. That's okay. But the Ukrainian Navy is non-existent as a force. The Ukrainian Air Force is also very small, but the Ukrainian Army is rather big, much better trained than in 14. They can mobilize a large additional reserve force, and if the West will begin providing weapons, like anti-tank modern weapons that Russia doesn't even have, like javelins, like attack drones and other stuff, the conflict may escalate and be not a short one, not a blitz, as most likely if Russia would go, and that's a big if it will. It would want to have a very swift operation like in Georgia in 08, a swift, decisive victory ending the fighting quickly, and as Russian officials have said, that will be the end of Ukraine in state as we know it right now. But if it really drags into a protracted proxy war, and there is a possibility of that, that's another very dangerous thing. Hopefully, the Kremlin doesn't want that, and it's more trying to negotiate from a position of strength to get Russian strategic objectives fulfilled. And the main strategic objective in the Ukrainian Donbass situation and everything there is that Russia does not want to, under any circumstance, to see Ukraine become a member of NATO.
Tony, we know Ukraine President Zelensky said Biden has assured him the U.S. will not leave Ukraine alone in this matter, and Biden administration has been very keen on building the cross-Atlantic relations and strengthen the NATO alliance. So how strong is U.S. commitment to Ukraine President Zelensky?
I'll link my answer to that to what we've just heard from Pavel. First of all, I think Zelensky's whistling in the wind. He's a weak president of no importance in Washington. Any assurances that he might think he's been given are worthless at this point. An important point about this proxy war that Pavel has mentioned a couple of times. It is not going to be a proxy war if it happens, because once the Russian army, the huge army of the huge neighboring states, becomes directly involved on Ukrainian territory, it ceases to be a proxy war right then. Russia will be there if it has to be. And I would mention here that an important development in the last few weeks on the diplomatic front is that Russia has made clear that it no longer cares about the good opinion of the West. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesman, even Lavrov himself, have all sent unmistakable public diplomatic messages that Russia can live with whatever sanctions America and NATO want to hook up, that Russia doesn't need the West anymore, and that Russia is essentially a self-sufficient nation, able to make its own alliances, including the very important developing partnership with China, and Russia doesn't care about pleasing the West anymore. Now, this is immensely important, because when you combine that diplomatic fact with Russian supremacy on the ground, on the sea, and in the air around Ukraine, it's no conflict. Russia decides to go in and take as much of Ukraine as it wishes to. I don't think Russia would wish to take anything more than the majority Russian-speaking areas, but they would involve the tools of the Ukrainian economy, the whole Black Sea seaboard, the city of Odessa, the industrial and rich agricultural areas in the south. It would really transform the European strategic landscape. And Russia doesn't want it to happen because Russia essentially prefers stability and maintenance of international order. But if they are pushed to the brink, it's quite clear now that it will happen. And so the views of Kiev in this are essentially unimportant.
Alexei, what's your take on this? Because some experts believe Ukraine is just a victim in this great power game between US and Russia, as Putin is testing Biden to see how far he could go. Do you share the same stand?
Look, I mean, I won't describe Ukraine as a victim, because on one hand, yes, it looks like a victim because, as I said, it all started as an internal civil conflict by 2015 and turned into effectively a proxy war between Russia and the United States, to less extent Europe, because European stake in Ukrainian military conflict has always been quite limited. But on the other hand, it's not that Ukraine was just caught in the middle and they are accepting their fate. Obviously, there are forces on both sides in Kyiv as well as in Lugansk and Donetsk that contributed to the fueling of tensions and the fueling of confrontation. For the official government in Kyiv, reintegration now is probably looks like a very remote reality, because 6 years have passed through the since effectively the secession of the two breakaway provinces. And by that time, people in those provinces, while some obviously missing Ukraine, but certainly they were living and operating within the Russian information space. To reintegrate them in Ukraine that lives and breathes of a very strong anti-Russian propaganda would always be mission impossible. And I don't think the Ukrainian authorities would actually be interested in reality to integrate those provinces. A, because they will always have resistance there. B, they will get a very powerful electorate base that would not support the current regime in Kyiv. And that electorate base is likely to vote for whatever pro-Russian party will emerge on the Ukrainian political horizon. Same goes for Crimea. Mm-hmm. I think the current government in Ukraine is quietly relieved that
Crimea become president of all 17 former republics.
They lost about 2 million or so hardcore pro-Russian voters who continuously supported, like the Regions Party that used to be perceived as pro-Russian party in Ukraine. The reality, it wasn't. And in this sense, the current authorities in Kyiv, President Zelensky, are not interested in changing the electoral landscape, especially in the eyes of their elections that are going to be held in Ukraine. So it is something that I think the Ukrainian authorities did it on purpose, as well as and same goes for the leaders of the breakaway republic. So by and large, calling Ukraine just a victim, well, they did a lot of actions themselves, be held responsible and accountable for. So I think it's not a straight answer here.
Pavel, in his conversation with NATO Secretary General, Zelensky said NATO is the only way to end the war in Donbass and reiterated Ukraine's desire to join the alliance. What role can NATO play in this conflict right now, in your opinion?
Well, NATO by itself right now is more of a kind of red rag for for Moscow. Because with Zelensky saying such things, well, he's pissing off a lot of important people here in Moscow for whom the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO is a nightmarish one, not totally unacceptable one. NATO has a small mission in Kiev. They're running different kind of educational programs to help the Ukrainian military be more kind of pro-Western in their operational kind of sense. Nothing much else they can do. NATO is a staff structure. It doesn't have its own forces. And it's a kind of allied staff structure that will take on possible action if there's an all-European war brewing up.
What the?
Apparently, we are not yet in an all-European war situation, though the threat does really exist, basically. So NATO will be, as always, on the sidelines. It would be individual Western nations, America, France, Germany, who can, maybe Turkey in this kind of present situation, I don't know, Poland, that will take the initiative to do something. And they should take the initiative because the conflict should be refrozen. Having a kind of all-European war threat situation, or even a nuclear war, God forbid, just because someone's fighting someone in the Donbass, well, that's ridiculous for a lot of people around the globe. So something should be done to Kissingerian style, to really find a way to freeze this conflict for the foreseeable future. Push away, de-escalate now, and see that it stays de-escalated for the foreseeable future. And that would involve giving Russia particular guarantees to begin with. It's the reinstallation of those pro-Russian TV channels that Zelensky took off the air, so the squashing of the case against Viktor Medvedchuk, so that the pro-Russian fraction in the Rada continues to be an official political force to be reckoned with inside Ukraine. And that's some guarantee for Moscow that Ukraine is not going to go rogue and into NATO.
Tony, how big factor could NATO play in this? As we know, NATO has been stepping up its military buildup in many countries who share borders with Russia. In fact, the very purpose of the establishment of the NATO is to contain the former Soviet Union bloc. So is Russia still the threat, as NATO says it is?
Well, NATO has been subject to a lot of European members of NATO have been subject to a lot of pressure from Washington, from the war party in Washington, which has been strengthened by the election of Joe Biden, to, as it were, consolidate the alliance under US leadership to get back to the old status quo of a strong, united NATO confronting Russia. And the reason why there are strong domestic political forces for this in all NATO countries is quite simply the military-industrial industries, the intelligence industries, the mainstream media supporters of those industries that want a high level of tension with Russia to maintain the war economy for economic reasons. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that I think Pavel is absolutely right. Russia is looking for signals from Kiev that it will allow legitimate space within Ukraine for the expression of multicultural rights, for the expression of pro-Russian sentiments, for the protection of Russian language rights. Ukraine is not and never will
Get
be
those Belarusian tractor parts in before all hell breaks loose.
Anti-Russian country. And the effort to try and make it that is simply destabilizing and threatens the peace of all of Europe and indeed ultimately possibly all the world. So all of that is correct. And I also think it's correct that both sides need to look now at realistic ways to go back to a frozen conflict in the eastern provinces. The eastern provinces, I don't think Putin wants them to leave Ukraine in a sovereignty sense. I think he's quite happy for them to stay under Ukrainian sovereignty. But the price of that is for Ukraine to allow them to live in peace the way they want to live within the Russian world, within the Russian information space. And that's a very good phrase, by the way. So everybody has to moderate their expectations. And ultimately, it's down to Joe Biden, I think. And he's a smart old guy. I don't think he's a fool. And he will see the writing on the wall. He will know what messages Russia is sending to him. And I think we're going to see a period of very cold peace for a few years. Very cold peace indeed. But I don't think we're moving towards a hot war in Ukraine.
Alexei, we've seen much cooperation between Russia and the European Union, the Nord Stream 2, COVID-19 vaccine, etc. How much do they need each other today? Do you think the EU really want to get into a war or even a high-level conflict like this in the eastern Ukraine?
No, I don't think the EU has any interest in being dragged into any form of conflict or confrontation. Ideologically, the EU obviously feels very uneasy about Russia, but there is also a pragmatic realization that European nations need Russian resources, need access to the Russian market, just like the Russians need European investments, need cooperation with Europe. In this sense, I would disagree with Tony's proposal that Russia can easily give up on its European vector and on its relations with the United States. I think for Moscow, despite all the conversation that yes, we can live without Europe, and as Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov described, the current state of Russia-EU relations has been completely destroyed. There is still an interest, and there is a very powerful pro-European lobby that still in existence in the Kremlin. So for the Europeans, they would prefer to negotiate a way out of this crisis with Russia. We need to remember that European capitals are not really impressed with the way how Kiev behaves. Kiev hasn't addressed a number of core criteria that's been put forward to the Ukrainian authorities by the European and United States donors, including the fight for corruption and civil rights and liberties. When the Ukrainian authorities effectively say that everyone has to learn Ukrainian and speak Ukrainian and they cannot speak any other languages, well, it's not just an attack on Russian-speaking population. I mean, there is a very strong unease about this in western parts of Ukraine among ethnic Magyars who have been backed by Hungary. I mean, the Poles have their views on what's happening in Ukraine, also with regards to glorification of Ukrainian nationalists who committed atrocities against the Polish population in Ukraine. So the European position is quite mixed. They want Russian gas, and in this sense, the ongoing position by Germany, who insist on the completion of the Nord Stream, is quite evident. On the other hand, the Europeans are not happy and quite disappointed with Russia's behavior. They truly believe that Russia has committed criminal acts like poisoning of its political opponents on European
one of the stories I
territory
heard about
that
these
Russia interferes
Apotex people that got killed, the $5 billion heirs, was that the police said for some reason that it was 2 Russian operatives, but they knew there was nothing they could do about it. And now I don't know if that's true.
And support a way how to maintain maybe complicated,
I don't even know if the police ever said that.
But nonetheless important dialogue with Russia, which been something that has been actively underlined by, say, French President Macron, as well as German Chancellor Merkel. And certainly Europe doesn't want to be caught in between, just like Ukraine, of the power contest and power struggle.
I can't remember if it's this guy, but they
that is
cut off
between
right
Washington
halfway through one of his
and Moscow.
posts. It's the
Europeans
first
lived
half
through
of the
that
video.
war during the Cold War. They don't want to see the repetition, and they certainly don't want to be targets of Russian tactical nuclear munitions.
Pavel, how do you foresee Russia and European nations' relations? How reliable are U.S. NATO allies to Biden's administration nowadays after 4 years of Trump's American First policy?
We were supposed to have a Canada First defense strategy, but we didn't do it.
Donald Trump is out of the White House, and that Biden has announced that the United States is back, and they're kind of thrilled with that, and that means they're going to be ready to back America or much more than they would have in other circumstances. Though a lot of Europeans and those who I talked to, officials, are really, really frightened with what is happening, how the situation is unraveling around Ukraine. They wanted to move away from Ukraine. They wanted to have other agendas with Moscow, because Ukraine is, well, everyone's been there since 14, and it leads to no good at all. They want to put this into a kind of box, and for the time forget about it and work on other more kind of mutually interesting issues with Russia. But that's not happening. Ukraine's out of the box, and no one really knows for sure what to do. They're having meetings in Brussels on different levels. They're frustrated. No one knows really how to put Ukraine back into the box and get to other more interesting business. This is a nasty situation. I mean, not enough talking, too much military movements without talking. It's very dangerous and very frustrating. Someone should really begin to do something more. But no one's really ready, apparently, to stick his head out. Borrell came to Moscow. His visit was a total disaster. And Merkel talked to Putin, apparently also without much results. Attempts. The Russian and
the fuck was
diplomats
that?
and American diplomats are exchanging barbs. It's not good at all. It's not productive. It's counterproductive what's happening. And that's the worst part.
Much as we love to hear you finish your point, unfortunately, we run out of time for today's panel discussion. That's it for this edition of World Today with me, Glenna. Thank you so much for joining us.
Jesus, there's weed everywhere on my fucking floor.
Hello everyone, this is Moon Ahmed Khan, journalist from Pakistan, currently based in Tsinghua University.
Motherfucker, someone just stabbed me in the fucking ribs, and I don't know how that's possible. I feel like a fucking sewing needle or some shit. Okay. What I was talking about was on the radio a couple years ago, there's two people, Barry and Honey Sherman, that are they're the couple that ran Apotex, owned Apotex, whatever, worth $5 billion. And at one point, what we heard on the radio, but they changed the stories up here all the goddamn time, is that they were killed by, the police thought they were killed by 2 Russian operatives, that they knew who they were, but they would never be able to catch them. Or some shit. $5 billion. Yeah, those are the people that make generic drugs, piss off the other pharmaceutical companies. Now we got a worldwide virus. Very coincidental. Oh, so the Chinese. Ah, damn it. One problem after another. I'm just gonna roll that fucking weed, eh? Fuck you.
Hello, this is Michael John.
Greetings from Los Angeles of the Golden State, California. Thank you today for making me part of your team. I truly enjoy.
So the Chinese, what just happened? Let's break the computer too. The Chinese have over 200 vessels in the Philippines that they say are fishing vessels. The Philippines says are, oh, for fuck's sakes. I'm gonna click dismiss on this right now. The Philippines says are some type of, I believe they use the term militia. That's China, one of their groups they call the militia, but it's part of the government. It's not like our version of a militia. Basically, people that are like unofficially part of the army, I think, in their official counts or something, if I understand correctly. Russia's moving all sorts of troops onto the Ukraine border and or wherever the disputed zone, let's call it that, and have pulled their ICBMs out of hangars or silos or wherever they keep them so that the U.S. spy satellites can see them. And the only people talking about this right now is China Radio International. And I'm in Canada, just to be clear. I'm going to tell you something. If Russia shoots an ICBM at Washington, D.C., and it falls short, look to the north where that's going to land. That's going to be in my backyard. Yeah, a year ago, most of this shit was basically, if you started talking about what if Russia did this or what if China did that, oh, you're paranoid, or that was decades ago, Grandpa. That's. What are the odds they run the exact same show again? Because it's the first 15 minutes.
Unilateral sanctions and confront each other. Bonn said France will properly.
Yeah, and that's the other. France, Germany, and Russia have some sort of a treaty agreement on vaccines or some shit.
Doing it in the right way.
Russia supplying
take away Chinese,
Germany
where you can take some
and
Chinese away
Germany. This Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They supply China with natural gas and Ukraine. Actually, a few years ago, that was the issue. They were cutting off Ukraine's gas in the middle of one of the coldest winters they ever had because they wanted to be paid. Gazprom. I better do another check and just make sure.
Now the news.
By the way, the dish and the lid fell this way, but the lead went fucking everywhere.
To maintain continuity and stability of their relations and to jointly confront destabilizing factors in the world as well as various global problems. He made the remarks in a phone conversation with Emmanuel Bon, diplomatic counselor to French President Emmanuel Macron. One suggested that both sides should not randomly interfere in each other's internal affairs or even impose unilateral sanctions and confront each other. Bon said France will properly handle sensitive issues on the basis of mutual trust, adding that Paris stands ready to jointly play a big role in addressing global challenges such as climate change and biodiversity. The Iranian foreign minister is calling on the United States to return to the 2015 nuclear deal and lift all anti-Iran sanctions.
Jesus Christ, I almost got Iran.
Zarif followed the meeting of diplomats of parties to the deal, including
everything
Iran,
that happens,
Britain,
blah, blah, blah,
China,
between
France,
China and the
Russia,
US.
and Germany. The talks
Who's
in
buying the
Vienna
US
was
Treasury
aimed at
bills?
bringing the United
Where are they
States
getting the
back
money?
into the joint comprehensive plan of action.
China
It took place without the United
largest
States,
foreign exchange
which
reserves.
unilaterally left the deal in
They
2018
have money in every currency
under
already. They
then
just go
Donald
buy up
Trump.
whatever they need.
In response to the U.S. withdrawal, Iran has been steadily increasing its stockpile of enriched uranium, increasing the purity it's enriching, and installing and operating new, more efficient centrifuges. Tehran argues that Washington's departure from the deal was the first violation and that the U.S. must make the first move and remove sanctions before Iran returns to compliance. An official with the World Health Organization says the final decision on whether China's Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccines can receive emergency validation from the organization is expected between April 26th and May 3rd. The two drugs are on the final stage of evaluation by the emergency use listing, an internal procedure of the WHO to assess unlicensed vaccines. If approved, the vaccines can be used under the WHO-led COVAX facility, a scheme aimed at providing more equitable access to vaccines for low- and middle-income countries. Africa accounts for less than 2% of the 690 million COVID-19 vaccines administered globally. 43 African countries have begun inoculating high-risk groups. Morocco is the leader in vaccination on the continent, having administered 4 million doses to cover nearly 11% of its population. Only Seychelles and Mauritius have so far acquired enough vaccine doses to reach the 20% vaccination target. Mourners outside the Windsor Castle have paid tribute to Prince Philip, calling his death the end of an era for the royal family.
What if
Within
Russia
an
or
hour of
whoever,
the
what if
announcement around midday
everybody's always
local
waiting for
time,
things to go
members of
wrong, and
the
then
public
if my
began to
enemy,
lay
you know, is
flowers
sick with a
outside
cold, that'd
Windsor
be a good time to
Castle
go
and
punch him in the
Buckingham
face,
Palace
type of
in
thing.
London. Prince
What if
Philip's
they're
always
waiting
been
for the
there.
Queen
He's
to
a
die, Philip
stalwart,
to
isn't he?
die?
And his
So
service
the
to the
Commonwealth
country, to the
countries, you
Queen,
can't count on them for sure
and
to
the
go to
rest of
war.
us. Yeah, it's got to be done, hasn't it? I do think it's end of an era, but we do still have our Queen. How she's going to deal with it will be interesting, because he was, you know, great support to her, I believe. But
she's going to outlive all of us except for Magic Johnson.
The 99-year-old husband of Queen Elizabeth had helped to modernize the monarchy and steer the British royal family through repeated crises during 7 decades of service. The Duke of Edinburgh, as he was officially known, had been by his wife's side throughout her 69-year reign, the longest in British history. NASA's Mars helicopter Ingenuity will attempt its first flight on the Red Planet this weekend. Ingenuity arrived at Mars' Jezero crater on February 18th, attached to the belly of NASA's Perseverance rover. The helicopter is a technology demonstration with a planned test flight duration of up to 30 Martian days. The rover will provide support during flight operations, taking images, collecting environmental data, and hosting the base station that enables the helicopter to communicate with mission controllers on Earth. And that's the news.
Sure what part of the world you're talking about when you say you're neck of the woods. They don't really want to do a ground invasion of the United States. Damn it, this happened last time too. They're gonna distract. This means I got a half hour to finish. What is this?
Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Music Talks.
No.
Christian. We have Vladimir Putin wanting to perhaps make Russia great again. We're seeing moves with Russia and with China on our Arctic, which is worrisome. And there's also tensions within Russia. Why don't we start with what's happening with Alexei Navalny?
That's one of the reasons I play those radio dramas at night. There's little things that make me think, oh, you came in through the back door of the Ukraine.
There was wonderment on how what kind of pressure it was going to put on Vladimir Putin. And now I think Bill Browder has called this perhaps a slow killing inside of the prison. What do you make of the power that Navalny and his support has right now in Russia?
Yeah, and this really goes back to the turning point in 2007, when Russia made it clear it saw the West as a hostile entity, and that he was going to double down on authoritarianism, and was out of the cooperation game. And since then, I mean, it is really a very different world between Russia and China. It is a much more competitive, a highly contested world, and Vladimir Putin has made it clear that this contest is happening in all domains: political, economic, military. And so I think the lesson to take away from the observations that you've just made is that in Canada we continue to, I think, in many ways, have our head in the sand. That we need to understand the world for what it is, rather than for what we would like it to be. And that there are bad actors who are pursuing goals or visionist goals, hegemonic
Ontario
goals,
supposedly is at Toronto anyways, had the longest lockdowns in North America, supposedly.
To both
Depends how you look at it.
the West and democracy in general, but also to their own citizens. And I think what we see with Alexei Navalny, is, I mean, if Vladimir Putin wanted to take him out, they would just do so.
Well, they sort of,
they fucking point to citizens inside Russia that if you don't toe the line, or if you double cross me, we will make you suffer, and we will, and as a deterrent to anyone and everyone else who might think about engaging us. And of course, I think Vladimir Putin finds himself in a very challenging situation.
Remember, some of these guys are psychopaths. They got something to prove, man.
He sees sort of the flourishing of democracy around him,
There's a reason to go to war.
Challenges, especially economic challenges with the pandemic that he's facing, his legitimacy
And Canada, Justin Trudeau, has this idea: we're going to run a gas pipeline to the West Coast to a facility that hasn't been built yet to sell natural gas on ships to China for an import facility they haven't built yet. And that's when Russia built the gas pipeline into China. That was part of Trudeau's thing. He spent $4.5 billion on some pipeline that cost $500 billion supposedly. It's a 9-to-1 factor because it was a guarantee
that he's sending with Navalny, that he's not going anywhere, and he's prepared to take whatever measures both against the West and against anybody internally who might pose a threat to the sustainability of him and his regime.
He has a problem, though, Christian, doesn't he, with Navalny? He knew what he was getting into. He survived the poisoning. He came back and stood there with courage, and what he thought was going to happen has happened. He knows his power. He's releasing as much information as he can, and he is a very popular figure in Russia. He really challenges Vladimir Putin in a lot of popularity, doesn't he?
Yeah, so Navalny is, of course, a complex person from a Western democratic perspective. Look, Navalny is no Democrat. He is a hardcore Russian nationalist. And him coming to power would not mean that Russia would bring a regime change, but for instance, would not mean that Russia became this flourishing democracy. I think the West is behind him because from a Western perspective, we want free debate, and that there are certain parameters of political dissent that make societies better. And so it's a difficult situation because we're also backing someone whose views, in many ways, would be are not entirely aligned, shall we say, with Western interest, with democratic interest, or even with global or regional stability. And I think that's also why Navalny returned home. He knew exactly what awaits him, but he's a profound patriot and he's a profound nationalist.
You know, at the same time, because this is all really connected, isn't it?
Real Russian
the movement of Vladimir Putin. We have watched him on the corners of Ukraine, and now we are watching him make moves along with China along the Arctic. Again, you know, Canada has been criticized for having their head in the sand when it comes to China, and Russia is along there, and they kind of go hand in hand. How important is it for Canada to start protecting our waters?
Also, look, there's a nice tracker that CSIS, the Washington, D.C. think tank, puts out on Arctic military actions that sort of tracks nicely.
We just damaged one of our nuclear subs in August, and they told us last week.
The aerospace domain, the maritime domain, and the land domain. And those are, in many cases, very aggressive moves. But we need to understand that Russia is also not just within the Arctic itself, but working on some very threatening weapons, hypersonic vehicles, so missiles in particular, but also underwater autonomous vehicles that vastly reduce the time and vastly increase the speed at which these weapons
it increases the success of a mission in terms of not losing any of your soldiers. So if you have to risk one of your people to do a mission, it's way more likely they say, no, we're not doing that mission. If you can say it's just a robot, well, okay, let's go do it. The Arctic's not a good place to have problems, but if it's a robot,
we know how integrated it is and what disruption it causes, after we saw in Texas. And the Arctic itself, so Canada isn't playing Canadian.
Yeah, that's another problem.
The Arctic itself is now being contested by Russia, but also by China. And so we need to understand that we live in a very different world with very threatening weapons, and that our adversaries will exploit every opportunity we give them. And our defenses, when it comes to the Arctic and when it comes to North America in general, are simply not up to the task of the challenges and threats that we face in today's geopolitical environment, in particular from Russia and China.
And we've seen that. I mean, we watched it as we wondered even what was going to happen with NATO around the world. We've taken a lot of things for granted. Is this a big wake-up call here for our government right now?
So certainly I think there is a requirement to rethink how we do continental defense, but I think there's a broader rethink that needs to happen in the Canadian Armed Forces on data and communications, the command and control structures that go with that.
What were they telling us yesterday about the signals intelligence branch? They were telling us about the signals intelligence,
but also in terms of expeditionary deployments So it is very much a geopolitical reassessment of where we find ourselves. This is also why my colleague Arcofield and I have recently written about the urgent need of a foreign intelligence service in Canada. We are simply, from a strategic assessment perspective and from a defense perspective, we are not adequately postured for the 21st century, and we are not adequately postured to assert our interests abroad. And the more we let these capabilities diminish,
thank God I didn't have it all broken up.
To assert our interests, and the more we end up at the mercy of both our adversaries and our partners in the United States. So it is important that we continue to play our part. And I would say that, I call this the Walmart approach to defense policy, that we don't want to make it completely discount. Canadian politicians have always sort of invested just enough in defense, but the just enough we've invested in the past is simply no longer enough for the security environment in which we find ourselves today.
Are we seeing finally both of these countries under a new kind of stress where they have to make these moves? China, we know what's happening, the tension between Canada and China, the Huawei executive, the extradition, America and trade, all these, and they're not backing down. They've been very, very aggressive when it comes to Canada. And the same thing with Vladimir Putin. I mean, there's a sense that inside of Russia, despite all the moves by Vladimir Putin, that
kind of stress where they have to make these moves. China, we know what's happening, the tension between Canada and China, the Huawei executive, the extradition, America and trade, all these, and they're not backing down. They've been very, very aggressive when it comes to Canada. And the same thing with Vladimir Putin. I mean, there's a sense that inside of Russia, despite all the moves by Vladimir Putin, that, that inside there is a feeling of tenuousness of his power there. Does that make us more vulnerable, Christian?
We live in an era of permanent conflict below the threshold of nuclear attack. That is to say, our adversaries are exploiting every opportunity to press us at every point they can.
Coincidentally, you guys who can't stand Trudeau are going to use this to pressure him. You should go to war. You should go to war. You should go to Trudeau's fault we got in that war.
Of permanent conflict. And so conflict happens in the political, the diplomatic, the military, the economic sphere. And so that's what we need to posture ourselves against, and we need to realize that our adversaries are highly committed and are highly persistent in pressing us hard on every front, precisely because
the Russian gas pipeline thing is a direct response. It seems to be a direct response to Canada.
Nothing that authoritarian regimes want more than to stay in power.
Natural gas on a boat. That sounds stupid.
Holding on to power in China and in the Russian regime at any and all cost.
All right. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, Christian. We really appreciate it. You take care.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you, Arlene.
Turkey shot down a Russian plane
professor at the Royal Military College, Queen's University, and a senior fellow at the MacDonald Laurier Institute. All right, we're going to take a break. I'm Arlene Bynum for Alex Pearson, and when we return, it's Counterpoint. This is Global
News Radio. Was there one thing that the Russians and the Chinese both, neither one really want to do like a land invasion with all sorts of soldiers to like North America, because there's way too many people, crazy people with guns. It's a huge amount of like manpower to throw at the problem. But they said, what was it, yesterday, the day before, a few days ago, that there's been 10 intercepts in one day of Russian fighter jets. What they do is they fly up to the edge of where NORAD can see them, and then they flip around and go back home. But they're trying to see how far they can go to get a response from the Americans. That's going to be on commercials for like 8.5 fucking minutes. See what BBC says. I need to smoke a fucking dog. No, like I could cope. Like if I didn't have weed or whatever, okay, we're all going to war. I guess I'll be okay. I guess. I think that means, what is this? Is all things considered. Don't they tend to do morning news shows Monday to Friday, right? It's Friday. this, okay, so we're just on hold here. Please maintain your position in the queue. If they launch, if one ICBM falls short, I want to know
the humanization of communities.
What the computer model show would happen to Lake Ontario or any of the Great Lakes if a warhead landed in it and then blew up inside the lake. What would happen to it?
The global health crisis has profoundly affected the entire spectrum of human rights in every region,
under those lakes,
further fueling discrimination, social polarization, and inequalities, all of which can lead to violence and conflict. We saw what happened in Rwanda in 1994, and we know the horrific consequences when hate is allowed to prevail. Preventing history.
Yeah, we're well aware that's where World War II comes in.
Elsa Chang, and I'm Audie Cornish.
It's well worth
British
listening
loyalists
to,
who want to stay part of the United Kingdom called off their protest in Northern Ireland today. They did so after the death of Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince Philip, which brought a temporary pause to some of the worst rioting Northern Ireland has seen in years.
Everybody's trying to put
NPR's Frank Langford in Belfast. Frank, give us the context. What's been happening in Northern Ireland this past week, and at what point did things change today?
Checkmate.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, Audie. Basically, riots started about a week ago. British loyalists throwing Molotov cocktails, carjacking, burning a bus, police put out water cannon yesterday. And ostensibly, this is over partly to do with Brexit. Brexit has created a new border in the Irish Sea, basically cutting people here off from what they consider the motherland, Great Britain. They're very angry about it. And there was a lot of chatter on social media today that there would be a lot more protests across the city tonight. Then word this morning came that Prince Philip had died, and signs went up in an area that I was last night where there was a fair bit of clashing with the police saying that they wanted to postpone these protests, which have really been riots, because of respect for the Queen and the royal families. And mostly tonight, Belfast is surprisingly quiet.
Do they have anything else to say about what this halt in the protests might mean, kind of what was behind their decision?
Well, I think that one thing you'll find when you talk to people in Northern Ireland who are British loyalists, they have a great love for the royal family. And it's funny, it was one I was talking to today who was saying, we feel sometimes more British than the people across the water in Great Britain.
Some people talk
and I certainly encountered that as well. It was also poignant. It kind of gets to the psychology and identity here of being Northern Ireland apart from the rest of the United Kingdom. And he said when he's in England, a lot of people just treat him and consider him Irish because of his accent. And of course, he feels he's part of the United Kingdom, and he feels like a foreigner in his own country. And I think a lot of people here in Northern Ireland they feel that way when they're over in Great Britain.
What's going on in the
over here,
nationalist areas where people do tend to favor closer links to the Irish Republic?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, many people here would like to unite with the Irish Republic, and that's what they have wanted for many years. And maybe one day they might be able to have a vote on that. I'm actually in a neighborhood right now, a national.
Anthony Fury, Toronto Sun, Post-Media columnist and national comment editor. Hi, Anthony. How are you doing?
Hey, Arlene, I still live in Ontario, but other than that,
okay, it's good to know you're out there somewhere. Bob Richardson, Senior Counsel at National Public Relations. Bob, how are you tonight?
Oh, plus there's this whole thing with the two Michaels, the two Canadian guys named Michael.
No. Every visit is a joy and a pleasure.
For the Huawei executive for doing business with Iran on a U.S.
slathering it on both of you here. Let's begin. I mean, there's a lot of really disturbing news that's happening. An hour ago, I'm just seeing the Associated Press released a story that countries worldwide today were hit with these new records for all these virus cases and deaths, and listing them one from Brazil and all around the world. Here in Ontario, that over 4,000 mark was hard to take. Before we try to unpack and get some analysis, here's Isaac Bogosh with kind of a nod to things to come.
The number will probably go higher before it starts to get better. We're not going to see the benefits of the current measures that are in place for about another 10 to 12 or so days. So I think people should get ready because you're going to see some pretty ugly numbers soon.
All right, Anthony, what do you make of where we are right now? I began the show with some of the news. I actually went back and looked at where we were exactly a year ago today. I think there was like 483 cases and everybody was freaking out. We were frightened and didn't know where we were. And if anyone had told us a year later we'd be over 4,000, we'd be shocked. How do you feel today?
Hey, it's funny talking about looking back a year ago. I actually did that today. I read a column of mine, February 20th of last year, and the headline is, Canadians might need to prepare for something called social distancing. And to think that those were novel ideas, nobody had heard of these terms back then is hilarious. And I said, who would have thought we'd be at 4,000? And yes, a lot of people thought, okay, we were on a massive downward trend, of course, from the January highs. Although we did get that modeling that said Ontario will see 20,000 cases per day roundabout now. So, I mean, it's unfortunate that we've seen this uptick, but we still haven't hit the sort of high-end scenario of that modeling, not that we want to. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of caveats to keep in mind moving forward, and I always wish we'd move towards a bit more of a targeted response in terms of things. I'm very frustrated that we're in this third lockdown, and I don't necessarily see it's the path forward, and I take a bit of issue with what Dr. Bogash says about seeing the impacts, 12 days from now, because you read a lot of essays, reports, studies. Is lockdowns the single variable in all of this that gets these numbers underway? And it's not so clear it is.
Well,
you're not talking about Russia. Well, you sucked me right in. It's all about the fucking
20,000 or whatever we would have, and that's if you do nothing. And so that's the concerning part, Bob. I'll throw it to you. I mean, we have over 4,000, and we have done something, and we've done a lot. We also have moved into a different kind of a strategy. Anthony says he wished it would have happened earlier, but we've seen a turnaround strategy now, things that make sense.
So
let's get into these hot zones. Let's start vaccinating these people.
They're telling us that our droplets actually go 30 meters. It's about 100 feet.
I think we need to be prudent. I think the work that's going on.
The only way around this is ventilation. You need ventilation. You need fresh air brought into every structure. These people breathe the same air over and over. They're being exposed over and over and over. They eventually get infected no matter what.
So look, they're doing the things that they need to do to make sure that we have the appropriate capacity, and I think all that's important. But let's remember how we got here. We got here because we had...
Somebody ate a bat that wasn't cooked.
Sally and Jane had a coffee outside of their bubble. We got here because government failed us when 900 people at Amazon got COVID and they failed to go in. They failed us on distribution centers. They failed us in manufacturing. They failed us in construction.
Stores,
they failed us in low-income neighborhoods.
Commercial landlords, residential landlords.
And they knew all along that those were the areas where we had the most problems and where we ought to be putting the most resources. And what did they do? They did next to nothing in those areas. So we are still in what was reaped by government. And frankly, probably all of them can take a bow, but on this one, primarily the provincial government. And I'm glad that they've pivoted. I'm glad that they've done a 180, but that's why we have a problem today, and that's why we're in a lockdown today. And like a lot of people, I'm furious about it.
There is anger. That's, I talked about the emotion as we began the show. There was fear, shock, a little bit of awe on how we could have turned things around. And here we are. We do have anger. Anthony, there's no clear-cut picture here. And our sympathies go out to politicians. But, I mean, they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. Clearly, the province was trying to react to those who wanted to get out, to open things up. We've got private businesses. But on the other hand, they had to turn it around because, what did they say? They were going to wait to see if the predictions started to come to fruition. Well, here we are, Anthony. Is there a finger of blame that you're pointing here?
Well, to your point about anger, I think people are right to be angry, and I think it's only going to mount. The fact that we are in a third lockdown that is in many senses stricter than any of the ones before, and yet we've had a year to supposedly learn about how to respond better to this. Deal with those targeted locations that Bob's talking about and you're referring to there. So I know we're seeing more businesses say, no, we're not doing it. And there's more protest from those businesses. I'm aware of parents who are issuing various legal actions and tribunal hearings against school closures to get schools reopened. I imagine those weak protests, which initially began with people holding up signs about how there's some sort of Bill Gates 5G conspiracy. I don't even really understand what those arguments are. I think that those protests are now morphing to see more and more regular people who are appearing saying we just don't like all of this. And I think people are right to make their voices heard about all of that and to push for that more targeted approach. I mean, finally, we're getting pop-up targeted vaccination clinics in places like Thorncliffe Park for, I believe, everybody who's over the age of 18.
Said we're not going to be able to vaccinate our way out of this because the variants are basically, in simple terms, moving way too fast.
So at the same time, we're scaring people who think, oh no, I'm going to go to the grocery store in this low-risk area, and I'm literally shaking. You hear that from people, whereas the truth is there's been pretty much zero transmission in grocery stores for customers. Why are we creating scenarios where people are afraid to go to the grocery store?
They're not doing contact tracing.
We need to do.
How the fuck do you know if you're not doing contact tracing?
Well, we went inside the hospitals and talked to an ICU nurse who said it's just shocking how different it is, Bob. Younger and younger, not so sure how they got it. And these variants have thrown a different spin on it. You know, people are careful when they go to the grocery store. I am careful. You know, you share air if you're in a crowded space.
The grocery stores are actually pretty good at having their ventilation systems running really well.
I have to tell you, I've gone into a couple of stores when things were opening up, and I didn't feel
anyway,
good
it'll
about
put
it.
you off wanting to
There were
buy
people
food.
being careless with their masks who were working there. Bob, is this about, I mean, this anger that we're talking about, are those protests, are they targeted enough on what people should be angry about, or is there just a kickback against
Angry
it?
callers. We need angry callers.
I think it's probably, unfortunately, Arlene, a combination of all of the above. I think there's a bit of a kickback because people are just angry, and sometimes you get angry about the wrong thing. I think people are rightly angry about the manner in which this has been handled for the last 6 months. And then I think we're also still making some dumb decisions on anything in outside fresh air. Let people do kind of what they want outside. There's virtually no data to suggest that there's massive outside transmission.
People said no data is data, and that's science. Is a soundbite.
If they want to sit on a park bench, if they want to do a variety of different things, we ought to be letting them do that. We got a lot of people in the downtown core of this city who are in
people driving around with their windows rolled down and crackheads walking up to the window. Got money?
They need space. And, you know, locking them up is going to enrage them. And when you enrage them, you get some of the wrong responses that we were talking about. So, you know, I think we need to be smart about this, but we need to understand the human psyche a little bit more and a little less bureaucratic roundtable.
That's the funny thing
All right,
about
we're
this
going to take
whole
a break.
last
When we
year. You
return,
tell
let's
people
step
there's a
outside.
disease
Let's
that's
move
going to make you
into
really
the
sick
liberal
if you
convention
get it,
arena.
or
Anthony
you'll
Terry,
pass
Bob
it to somebody
Richardson
else
on the
and they'll
panel
get really
tonight.
sick and possibly die.
And Counterpoint brought to you by
Everybody goes
Pizzaville,
apeshit and fucking
pizzaville.ca,
does everything they can to pass it around.
736-3636. I'm Arlene Bonin for Alex tonight.
That's what happened
We'll be
to him.
back with more Counterpoint right after this.
Oh yeah, and as for this Iran thing, where I live, this building I'm in is a high-rise, 22 floors, whatever, Toronto. Next door. So there's 2 railroad lines right here. There's 2 more over there. That's why you may or may not hear them, but trains pass by all the time. On the other side of that, the very next address is a uranium fuel pellet facility. Nuclear fuel pellet facility. Right. That makes that a pretty strategic point of interest. I need to smoke a joint. I think we got 30 minutes to kill before anything interesting happens.
To leave.
You're going to be talking
And beyond news,
about
I'm
Prince
Dylan
Philip,
Moss
aren't
in
you?
London. Officials say hackers are trying to extort the University of Colorado after a cyber attack in late January potentially exposed students' personal information from hundreds of thousands of files.
That's what that means.
That information includes medical and social security numbers. School officials say the hackers posted small amounts of data online and are threatening to post more if they are not paid. But University of Colorado officials say they will not comply following guidance from the FBI, which is now investigating the breach. Stocks finished higher on Wall Street to end the week. The NASDAQ added 70 points, up about 0.5%.
Out of curiosity.
For several nights on end writing. In the latter part of that year, our food supplies ran out. For 2 months, it was black soybeans every day,
This
which
could be one of
upset
the
our
most
stomachs.
harshest stories.
To make things
This guy's
worse,
voice
those
will
were
be
the months when
associated in
Mao
your
was
mind with some of
extremely
the
busy,
harshest
no longer
stories.
differentiating between night and day. At intervals of 3 to 5 days, he would engage in a 72-hour workday. In addition to directing operations in the various war zones around the country, Mao wrote a large number of monographs, including The Strategy.
Jesus Christ. That's China Radio International. So SAP,
hosting a show or anything like that. So this is a brand new experience.
Rubbing his forehead hard, as he would often do that.
United Nations, they're going to be talking about nothing.
Security, stability, efficient and accountable institutions, and societal transformation. Building sustainable peace and development has demanded of Rwandans to face the truth of our painful past.
And that's the other. So China is a part of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There's the African Union. There's the United Nations. An Italian diplomat envoy, his driver, and a bodyguard, something to that effect, all got killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo recently, last few months. Where was I going with that? China is the largest contributor of money and manpower to the United Nations. That was the UN World Food Program. I don't know why. I need to smoke a joint to make sense of anything. This is my only viewer now. I don't know why the viewers are.
Those rap best people forget, cause they'll blast you with a Mac, and that's that. It's fucked up how niggas want my head over fame. It's a shame, cause I'm.
Vito Rizzuto was the head of the Montreal Mafia. He was a man with many enemies, but Rizzuto died of natural causes.
The Mafia. A secret order dedicated to Cosa Nostra. This thing of ours.
You violate what you know about this life, and you're gonna burn in hell like the sand is burning in your hands.
Ruckus. Niggas wanna hate, cause I'm getting on now. They wanna shoot me down, click, click, pow, pow. Niggas wanna hate, cause I'm getting on now. They wanna shoot me down, click, click, pow, pow. Niggas wanna hate, cause I'm getting on now. Cause I'm getting on now. Niggas wanna hate, cause I'm getting on now. They wanna shoot me down, click, click, pow, pow. Have more respect for the track, not rap as people get, cause they'll blast you with a Mac, and that's that. It's fucked up how niggas want my head over fame. It's a shame, cause I love their mind. Insane like G, but not quite like me. One of a kind, on my grind. Fuck yeah, I'm a hood hopper. I'm well known all over. My niggas is connected with AJ.
No, I should. If I, how do I stop the music? I can't stop the music. About Jesus, like we know we're being harassed digitally. Like you pick the most insane fucking things to show. Yes, Mr. Up and Down. Here we go. Holy fuck! I've known for 2 fucking minutes you've been trying to make that happen, bro. You're a waste man. Go away. Go harass somebody else for a little while. Holy shit. So at some point the music should either play or not play. Man, thanks. Now the menu I would use. If I press and play. Nothing. Of course. And I can't take it off split screen. Wow, you're so skilled. You're such a skilled waste man. You're not a hacker. By any means. So we have an idiot that harasses us, and one of the things that sets him off is me smoking weed. No, that's bad. He's going to punish me, and I'll stop doing it. Or whatever. I guess on these videos. Part of my user interface is not working right now. Fucking hell. Matt, your connection is unstable. I'm well aware. I'm watching the lights on the router flashing the most interesting of patterns. Well, this is going to happen over and over. The only reason I haven't killed it so far is because I can still hear the mic is still working. But I need this to work within the next 20 minutes. If I can't get it going in about 10 seconds, I'm gone. I'm just going to start this over. I don't know why these fucking chomos keep bothering us. Go back to the whole last 74 minutes and find what reason. Okay, Chomo, you're getting mad. You're going to show me weirdo edited photos of me. That's good, bro. That's essentially what you're doing.